Welcome to the EPG Pathshala in Linguistics. In particular, welcome to the Morphology and Syntax paper. I'm Prabal Dasgupta, responsible for the Morphology and Syntax paper. I work at the Indian Statistical Institute. In this session, we shall discuss the material from the module called Managing the Traffic of Processes. We mean, of course, the processes called syntactic transformations. We begin with a very minor technical point, a point that perhaps has occurred to you anyway in the course of your exercises, but we want to make it explicit. We want to introduce a convention called tree pruning, or pruning for short, as it is usually called. If, as a result of a transformation applying at any point in a tree, you end up finding one node repeated, in other words, occurring in two copies, one under the other, and if that repetition serves no purpose, then the double node is pruned into a single node. For example, if you consider the output of the transformation called particle movement, the transformation that takes an English verb particle construction and moves the particle to the right, before you began your work, the tree had a V node. Under the V there was V and particle, and under the V there was wrote, and under the particle there was down, for example, and wrote down the examples. Now when you have shifted down away, taking the particle away from this part of the tree which said V, V, PRT, leaves you with V dominating just V, and that second V dominating wrote. It is a bit silly to repeat the statement that wrote is a verb. Look at the tree and try to understand what is being said. If I write V and then wrote under the word V, under the element V, that says wrote is a verb. If I write V twice, then you're saying wrote is a verb, wrote is a verb. It makes no sense to repeat the statement that wrote is a verb. So obviously those two occurrences of V will have to be pruned into a single occurrence. That is what is called pruning. This is a relatively minor convention, but as you can see, it is part of traffic management. It is part of handling the way transformations are applied and the way we manage the consequences of applying transformations. Another aspect of traffic management is deciding which transformation can apply when, in what sequence or what order the transformations apply to a particular tree. That is where it becomes necessary to introduce the concepts of intrinsic ordering and extrinsic ordering. When you look at phrase structure rules, S goes to NP, VP, NP goes to det N, VP goes to V, NP, etc. You never find it necessary to ask, excuse me, which of these rules applies first and which one applies second. Why? Because there is a feeding relation among phrase structure rules. Some of them feed the others. For example, when you have S goes to NP, VP, and then VP goes to VNP, what you say here about NP, that NP goes to det N, that applies twice because NP appears twice in the boy kicked the ball, for example. In terms of the relation between rules, the VP goes to VNP rule feeds the rule NP goes to det N. What do we mean by feeding? We mean that the number of outputs for the rule NP goes to det n increases because of the application of the rule VP goes to VNP. VP goes to VNP donates one more NP for the rule NP goes to det n to apply to. That is called the feeding relation between two rules, where one rule feeds the other by donating extra input for that second rule. Phrase structure rules can feed each other. They can never snatch away potential input from another rule. They can never bleed another rule. Bleeding is the relation of snatching away potential input from the mouth of another rule. The difference between phrase structure rules and transformations is that transformations sometimes feed each other and sometimes bleed each other. And you have to be concerned with whether they are bleeding each other. In the case of phrase structure rules, there is no way for a phrase structure rule to take away input from another phrase structure rule. That is how they are made. The way they are made, there is no occasion for them to bleed each other. Let us consider actual examples in the case of transformations. In the sentence, whose surface structure is control yourself, won't you? We start the derivation with the deep structure, XU, X will, XOX, control yourself. We then apply primary anaphore licensing or bound anaphore licensing. The result of that is the output, the intermediate output. XU, X will, control yourself, because remember that transformation deletes XOX. After that, tag question formation applies, which gives you XU, X will, control yourself, won't you? Finally, imperative deletion applies to give you the surface structure, control yourself, won't you? Look at the order in which these rules applied. Bound anaphore licensing, tag question formation, imperative deletion. If you did not apply them in that order, for example, if you try to do imperative deletion before tag question formation, it would be impossible to get the tag question, won't you? Because the X will and the XU would have disappeared through imperative deletion. And tag question formation would not have had the right input to be able to echo the auxiliary and the subject of the original structure. It would not find a subject, it would not find an auxiliary. If that were to happen, we would have said imperative deletion has bled tag question formation. Imagine a variety of English in which tag question formation only applies to indicative sentences, never to imperatives. In such a variety of English, it would be appropriate to let imperative deletion bleed tag question formation, because you would want tag question formation to apply only to indicative sentences, giving you output like John has come late today, hasn't he? Mary hasn't arrived, has she? Those would be acceptable. But shut the door, won't you, would be unacceptable, because in such a variety of English, it would be a law that imperatives never have tag questions. However, in real life English, imperatives do take tag questions, which means that it's necessary for tag question formation to feed imperative deletion. There is a case where bleeding actually does occur among the rules that we have discussed so far. Consider gapping, which turns Ram loves Sita and Shyam loves Radha into Ram loves Sita and Shyam Radha. If you try to apply tag question formation, you can do it with the full form of the sentence. You can say Ram loves Sita and Shyam loves Radha, don't they? But if you try to apply it after gapping, you would get the sentence, Ram loves Sita and Sham Radha, don't they? That's a bad sentence. That's not something you say in English. In other words, what we were saying about the imaginary variety of English in which tag question formation fails to apply to imperatives. In real life English, that idea is instantiated in the case of gapping. The output of gapping does not allow tag question formation. In other words, the rule of gapping bleeds the rule of tag question formation. It snatches some potential inputs away from it. These are reasons for which we decide that transformations are extrinsically ordered, whereas phrase structure rules are intrinsically ordered. In intrinsic ordering, there is only feeding, there is no bleeding. And it is therefore not necessary ever to specify the order in which phrase structure rules apply. They can simply apply in any order they want. If they keep applying, they will produce the outputs that we are after. In the case of transformations, if you keep looking at the details of what is possible and what is not possible, you arrive at a list of transformations. And you're able to say transformations are drawn from that list in the sequence given. From the discussion so far, you can work out the sequence for the rules imperative deletion and tag question formation and gapping and so on. So far we have stuck to single sentences. We have not looked at cases of subordinate clauses embedded in bigger sentences. When we go to those cases, our story about the extrinsic ordering of transformations becomes complicated. Consider a sentence like, Ram seems to himself to like himself. The deep structure for that looks very outlandish if you're not used to generative syntax. The deep structure is delta aux x aux seems to himself, open a sentence boundary, Ram to x aux like himself. Bound anaphor licensing applies to the lower sentence, the one which is embedded. It gives you delta aux x aux seems to himself, lower sentence, Ram to like himself. This is now ready for raising to subject. So Ram moves from the lower sentence subject position to the upper sentence subject position like this, raising to subject. You now get Ram aux x aux seems to himself to like himself. After that, bound anaphor licensing applies again, this time to the higher sentence. The output becomes Ram aux seems to himself to like himself. Why you need the aux becomes clear in a later module. You will get to know where the agreement between aux and Ram becomes important. Our point is that in this sequence which we repeat for you, bound anaphor licensing on the lower S, raising to subject from the lower to the higher S, bound anaphor licensing on the higher S. We did not follow the convention that we were just talking about, where transformations are taken from a fixed sequence. We did bound anaphor licensing, then raising to subject, then bound anaphor licensing, breaking the rhythm. The solution to this puzzle is to say there is a fixed list. It doesn't change at all, but the list goes through the lowest sentence first, then you go to the next higher sentence and start from the beginning of the list and do the whole list again. Then you go to the next higher sentence and so on until you reach the top of the tree. In other words, you have a cycle. All the transformations first apply on the lowest cycle, then the next cycle, then the next cycle, until you reach the highest cycle of what is called the root sentence. The top S of the entire tree is called the root sentence because we imagine the tree as having its roots in the sky and its leaves on the ground. It's an upside down tree, if you think about it. That's why the top S is called the root node. So that's the root cycle, and there are these other cycles underneath. This is called the principle of the transformational cycle, or the cyclic principle. For the purposes of our discussion here, we are assuming that S, or sentence, is the only cyclic node, that you're going to cycle through the sentences. As we indicated in our preceding module, for some purposes the term circle applies only to sentences. For other purposes, you need to be more accurate and say all S's and some NP's are circles. Likewise, for the concept of cyclic node, you will find that sometimes an NP is a cyclic node. We don't have to give you examples. You will get them in advanced syntax. But for your purposes, you can simply assume that the only cyclic node is S. That you go to the lowest S, then the next higher S, then the next higher S. So that's the transformational cycle. These rules in the list that you apply one after the other, first on the lowest cycle, and that you keep repeating cycle after cycle, these are called cyclic transformations. Transformations that belong to the cycle. In a later module in this paper, we will teach you about other transformations that do not belong to the cycle, that are not repeated S after S after S. Those are called the root transformations. They apply only to the root sentence. They do not apply downstairs at all. That is not the subject matter of this particular module. We are mentioning this only to tell you why we are labeling these transformations in the fixed sequence as being cyclic transformations. Some transformations are cyclic, other transformations are root transformations. That is why we label these as cyclic. Nearly everything you have studied so far is a cyclic transformation. We will not tell you which ones are root transformations. You will find out in due course. If you're really curious, you can test all the transformations you have studied so far and see if one or two of them apply only in root sentences. Then you will discover it for yourself. And it does not have to be a secret that we divulge afterwards. You can crack the secret yourself. It's a free country. In the e-text, we spend some time explaining how the principle of the cycle can be tightened further into what is called the strict cycle principle. In order to explain how the strict cycle principle works, we ask you to imagine a language Oenglish in which an interjection oink, when it is introduced, produces some bizarre effects in the rest of the sentence. In the earlier module, we had proposed an index removal convention. That convention proposed that once a transformation has finished its work, if it has done any work with referential indices on the nodes, at the end of the application of the transformation, you can remove those indices because they have done their work. We have just seen an example where that version of the index removal convention becomes invalid. What is the example? We looked at a sentence like John seems to himself to like himself, where we found that bound anaphor licensing has to apply twice, once on the lower S cycle, once on the higher S cycle, with raising to subject sandwiched between them. Now there is a problem for the index removal convention. Imagine that the index removal convention applies indeed in the format in which we proposed it last time. In that case, on the lower S cycle, after the bound anaphor licensing transformation has applied, the index of the noun phrase Ram will be removed because it is no longer needed. Ram then undergoes raising to subject and migrates from the lower subject to the higher subject position. Then in the higher S, you try to apply bound anaphore licensing again. Alas, you will not be able to apply it because the structural description of bound anaphore licensing looks for an index on RAM. Remember, you have removed the index through the index removal convention. So the structural description is not going to be met, and alas, bound anaphore licensing will not apply to the higher S, and the sentence is going to crash. That is not what you want. You want to be able to derive Ram seems to himself to like himself. Therefore, Ram has to retain its index as it moves from the lower to the higher cycle. How can you do this? How can you tweak the index removal convention in such a way that all the indices get removed but not so early that they mess up later processes? The proposal we are going to work with is that when a transformation has finished applying, it will mark each index in the tree as volatile. It will say this index is marked for demolition. I am happy with it. It has served its purpose. It has done exactly what I wanted it to do, but now I don't want to look at it again. Bye. We make a distinction between a volatile index which has been marked for demolition and actual removal of the index, which gets rid of it completely. The advantage of this method is that you are able to exclude the derivations that you wanted to exclude, like Ram shaved himself without the X-ox monitoring the whole thing. And at the same time, the index doesn't get removed prematurely in the cases where the index is required again on a higher cycle. Now that we are going into the details of how these conventions work and how they make sure that some derivations crash whereas other derivations are successful, it is time to survey the class of examples that such a convention is designed for. There are 4 types of derivation that we want to filter out. When there is incoherent output, such as John washed herself, the reflexive herself is feminine and the antecedent noun phrase is masculine, so the two don't match, so the sentence is incoherent, we want that to crash. When the input is incoherent, for example, John seems Bill to be sad, where Bill cannot undergo raising to subject because there is a John sitting there, and Bill moving into the spot of John will cause John to be deleted non-recoverably, violating the principle of recoverability of deletion. The third class is where we have some element inside the sentence at the surface structure which should not be there, either a volatile element or a delta. The fourth class is what is called meaningless output. Sentences like sincerity admires John. So you've got 4 problems for which we would like to propose a filtering approach, that the derivation is filtered out, that it is rejected as a bad derivation. The 4 cases are where the output is incoherent, where the input is incoherent, where there is gadgetry in the output, and where the output is meaningless. Index removal is a convention designed for incoherent output. So let us assume that index removal takes care of that class of derivations to be excluded. What you're doing in this strategy is you're planting gadgetry in particular spots, you're planting indices, and that will cause the derivation to fall under the class of unwanted gadgetry in the output. In other words, you're converting one problem class into another problem class. You're converting incoherent output examples into gadgetry in the derivation examples, gadgetry in the surface structure examples. In the case of John seems built to be sad, it is the opposite problem from too much gadgetry. It is too little gadgetry. The deep structure of John seems built to be sad should have been delta seems built to be sad, where delta is a gadget designed to hold the place of the upstairs subject blank so that the downstairs subject can move into the upstairs subject. The reason John seems built to be sad is going to lead to a bad derivation, incoherent input. Can also be expressed by saying that you didn't put the right quantity of gadgetry there. Instead of generating a delta subject upstairs, you have generated an actual overt subject, and the two overt subjects are going to clash in the presence of a raising to subject trigger like seem. What about meaningless output? What about sincerity admires John? How do you deal with the problem of filtering out derivations that lead to meaningless output? In the classical period of generative syntax research, the 1960s, it was believed that it is the task of the transformational grammar to throw those out as well, to make sure that those derivations don't work. As a result, an elaborate apparatus was set up with selectional features and other special devices to make sure that a sentence like sincerity admires John never gets generated. Linguists have later come around to the view that that is not a linguistics problem. That is a literature question. They have come around to a way of thinking that says if some poet or some playwright or some fiction writer wants to say sincerity admires John, who are we to stop such a person from saying this? It is true that the sentence does not have a normal meaning, but you can force a meaning on it. Suppose there are these little boys and girls who admire John, and these little boys and girls are sincere. And in order to make a metaphorical point, instead of saying these little children admire John, suppose a person says, sincerity admires John. Who are we to stop such a person from expressing the thought in that fashion? It is true that to the normal ear, it sounds like a strange sentence which doesn't mean anything. However, there is nothing in the syntax to prevent sincerity admires John from being generated. You can see that by watching a person say the sentence in this metaphorical context, and the fact that you understand such a person quite well. That shows that there is no grammatical difficulty. It is not as if sincerity admires John is not English. You have to go case by case on this kind of issue. You have to look at particular sentences and decide whether they could perhaps be used in literature or not. But you see, looking at it case by case is not a job for the linguist. It is a job for the literary theorist to address. Linguists cannot handle the question. That is the current view, and that is the view that this course adopts. Now let us summarize what this module has tried to do. We are looking at traffic management issues in transformational grammar. We have looked initially at a very minor technical point, but it needed to be settled first, the point of pruning. Then we looked at the ordering of rules and pointed out that phrase structure rules are intrinsically ordered because they can only feed each other, whereas transformations are capable, formally capable of either feeding or bleeding each other, therefore they need to be extrinsically ordered. We initially gave you the idea that there is a fixed sequence of transformations in the kind of list, and that you take the transformations from that list following the sequence given. Then we showed you that this doesn't work when there are cases of embedding and the same transformation applies once to a lower sentence and once to a higher sentence, which led us to say, fine, let there be a cycle, let there be a principle that this list of transformations applies to the lowest S in the entire structure first, then to the next higher S, then to the next higher S, all the way to the root of the sentence. We then informed you that not all transformations take part in the cycle. The ones that do are called cyclic transformations. And we informed you that there are some other transformations applying only to the root, which are called root transformations. After going through the discussion of the cycle, we pointed out that now that there is a cycle, we need to change the index removal convention slightly, and we showed you in detail how it needs to be changed. That led us to survey all the classes of cases where we want a derivation to crash on purpose in order to prevent certain kinds of output from being generated. And we took a theoretical look at the question and divided the derivations that we want to exclude into several types and discussed them in detail. We concluded by saying that present-day syntacticians are no longer trying to exclude what is called meaningless output, sentences like "sincerity admires John," because syntacticians have decided that we are not the persons who should judge whether a grammatically well-formed sentence has a well-formed meaning or does not have a well-formed meaning. We should leave that question to the creative writers and to literary critics who judge their activities. That was the content of this module. We encourage you to look at the e-text. We sometimes deliberately withhold some of the e-text material in the oral presentation to compel you to go to the e-text. We hope that this slight deviation does not disturb you. If you do have questions about this or any other part of the course, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. We will try to answer your questions as quickly as possible. Thank you for your attention.